Welcome in, everybody. We're diving deep today into the world of philosophy for children. You sent over some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on this. Should be pretty interesting.
It's a fascinating area, especially for, well, a philosopher. I mean, just the idea that kids can actually think philosophically really makes you question what we think we know about how kids' minds develop.
Yeah, for sure. You usually think of philosophy as like this really complex thing only grown-ups can handle. But these sources are saying that kids might actually be naturally drawn to philosophical questions.
Exactly. And get this, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry actually challenges Piaget's theory. Remember, that whole thing about how kids don't develop abstract thought until they're like 11 or 12? Well, they're presenting a pretty strong argument that kids are way more philosophically capable than we give them credit for.
And it's not just theory either. There's some pretty compelling anecdotal evidence in Gareth Matthews' work. He talks about all these times when kids just spontaneously start thinking philosophically.
Oh, yeah, his examples are amazing. Like, there's this one about a 6-year-old who's licking a pot, and he just, out of the blue, asks his dad, how do we know everything isn't a dream? I mean, that's a pretty deep question for a kid who's barely started school, right? Goes straight to the heart of epistemology.
It's wild. It's like kids have this, I don't know, this pure and unfiltered way of questioning reality
Mm,
that we kind of lose as we get older.
yeah.
Matthews mentions another one where a 5-year-old is staring at a clock and asks how we can be sure the hand has only gone around once, even if we just looked away for a second.
Right. Gets you thinking about time and perception and all that.
Coding.
These anecdotes are so interesting, not just for the philosophical stuff, but also for what they say about how curious kids are and how they can wrap their heads around these big abstract ideas. And Matthews goes beyond just these one-off moments to show how kids can actually have whole philosophical conversations. He talks about this group of like 8 to 11-year-olds who got into this whole debate about fairness and rights, all because of a story about a boy named Ian and his friends who hogged the TV.
It's crazy how a simple thing like that can spark such a deep conversation. Makes you wonder how many philosophical moments we miss just because we underestimate what kids are capable of.
Absolutely. I think these examples should really make us rethink what we assume about kids and realize that they might have a lot more philosophical potential than we realize.
Okay, so we're seeing that kids can definitely philosophize, but how do we actually encourage that in a structured way?
Yeah.
That's where the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children, or IAPC, comes in, right?
Right. Matthew Lippman and Anne Margaret Sharp founded the IAPC, and they created a whole K-12 curriculum that's all about incorporating philosophical inquiry into education. Their main idea is this thing called the community of inquiry, where the classroom becomes a space for philosophical dialogue.
So it's totally different from the traditional way of teaching, where the teacher just tells you stuff and you sit there and listen.
Totally. The IEPC wants to create a much more dynamic learning environment where students are actually part of the process of creating knowledge. It's about valuing their ideas and encouraging critical thinking through respectful discussion.
And their most famous book, Harry Stottlemyre's Discovery, is a perfect example of that, right? A novel about a group of fifth graders tackling these philosophical questions with the adults just kind of guiding them along.
Exactly. And what's so cool about it is that it doesn't treat philosophy as some separate subject that you just study on its own.
Yeah.
It's woven into everything they're learning so they can use philosophical thinking in all sorts of situations.
Which actually fits with what Lippmann and Sharp are saying about how philosophy doesn't take away from other subjects. It actually makes them better. It helps students engage more deeply with everything they're learning by strengthening their critical thinking skills. But when we say critical thinking, what do we actually mean? The source gives us a few definitions, from Robert Ennis's quick one about reasonable reflective thinking focused on deciding what to believe or do, to the American Philosophical Association's much more detailed one.
And that brings up this really interesting debate within the field of critical thinking about whether it's something you learn for specific situations or if it's a general skill you can use anywhere.
Which, as a philosopher, I'm sure you find pretty interesting. Does learning to think critically about math problems mean you can think critically about ethical dilemmas? Or are those totally different things?
Yeah, it's a complex question with big implications for education and pretty much everything else. And the IAPC's focus on integrating philosophy into different subjects makes me think they lean towards the idea that critical thinking skills can be used in different areas.
Which makes sense, given that their whole goal is to give students the tools to think critically about anything and everything in the world around them.
It really makes you think, like, how does this whole approach change the way we think about knowledge and how dialogue fits into philosophical inquiry?
That's a good point. I mean, when you picture a philosopher, you usually think of someone all alone with their thoughts, right? Just wrestling with these huge ideas by themselves. But the IAPC is saying that even kids can do philosophy together as a community.
Yeah, and that connects to this bigger debate within philosophy itself. Is truth something you figure out on your own, or does it come from talking and sharing ideas with other people?
It's like that fundamental question that philosophers have been trying to answer forever. And the IAPC seems to be saying that it's all about dialogue. The community plays a big role in how we understand philosophy.
It's almost like they're saying philosophy is too important to just stay locked up in academia. It needs to be out in the world, in classrooms, everywhere, so everyone can explore it and debate it no matter how old they are.
And we've seen that kids can actually handle those kinds of discussions,
Mhm.
like Matthew's work and the research by Lone, McCall, Pritchard, Shapiro, Wartenberg.
Yeah.
They all show that kids can do this.
It's like everyone saying, hey, kids can think philosophically too. We just need to pay attention and give them the chance.
So where does all this fit in today? Has the Philosophy for Children movement gone beyond the IAPC?
Oh, yeah, definitely. The source material even talks about how it's become a global thing. There's the International Council for Philosophical Inquiry with Children, or ICPICE, which connects educators and organizations all over the world who want to bring philosophy into the classroom.
Wow, so it went from a small experiment to a worldwide movement.
Pretty much. And people are trying all sorts of different approaches now. The IAPC's program with Harry Stottlemyre's discovery is still really important, but there's also this growing idea that you can introduce philosophy in other ways, too.
Like what? I'm curious to hear what other methods people are using.
Well, for example, Tom Wartenberg came up with this program that uses classic children's books to get kids thinking philosophically. Instead of giving them some special philosophy textbook, he uses stories they already know and love, which makes it so much easier and more fun for them to start exploring these big ideas.
That's really smart. Using stories to introduce philosophical concepts just makes sense for kids. What else is out there?
Karen Murris has done a ton of work with picture books. You wouldn't think they'd be good for philosophy, but they can actually be surprisingly deep. They often deal with really complex themes that can spark some pretty profound questions in kids' minds.
Picture books, huh? That's fascinating. I never would have thought of that. But I guess when you think about it, they do have a lot of symbolism and abstract thought woven into them. It sounds like there are so many resources out there just waiting to be discovered.
For sure. The source material even lists some specific websites, books, and journals that go into more detail about all these different approaches. It's a field that's constantly changing and growing with new ideas popping up all the time.
It's like a whole world of philosophy for kids. This is so cool. So we've gone from those spontaneous philosophical moments that kids have to the more organized approaches of the IAPC and others.
And we've seen how this movement challenges what we thought we knew about how kids' minds work and what it even means to do philosophy.
The thing that really stands out to me is just how much evidence there is that kids are way more capable of philosophical thought than we give them credit for.
Totally. From those stories Matthews tells to the research that challenges Piaget's theory, it's clear that kids can handle these big ideas. It makes you wonder how many little philosophers are out there just waiting for someone to encourage them.
And if we really believe that kids can be philosophers, how does that change the way we think about education?
Imagine a world where philosophy is just a normal part of learning from the very beginning, where kids are encouraged to ask questions, think critically, and consider different points of view instead of just memorizing facts.
It would be a whole new way of thinking about childhood, about knowledge, maybe even about what philosophy itself is all about.
That's a pretty amazing idea, right? A world where everyone learns to think philosophically from the time they're little.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, do our schools today actually help kids develop those critical and creative thinking skills they need to deal with, well, with the world and everything in it, with all its complexity? I mean, think about all those standardized tests and how much emphasis there is on just knowing facts.
It's true. And if we really believe that kids can be philosophers, shouldn't we be giving them more ways to develop that ability?
It's a big question. Are we doing enough to encourage them to be curious, to ask questions, to challenge what they think they know? Are we giving them the space to have real discussions, to see things from different angles, to find their own philosophical voice?
And maybe when we talk to kids about these things, when we really listen to their ideas, maybe we learn something about our own philosophical journey too. Yeah, sometimes when we get so caught up in academic stuff and all these complicated theories, we forget about those simple but deep questions that kids ask.
The ones that make us stop and really think about things,
Yeah.
that remind us that There's still so much we don't know.
Exactly. When we listen to kids' philosophical ideas, it can be a good reminder to stay open to new ideas, to question ourselves, to be curious and humble about the world.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. We talked about what philosophy for children is all about, looked at the evidence that kids can actually think philosophically, and thought about what all this means for education and beyond.
There's so much to explore in this field, so many different ideas and approaches, and it's clear that we're just scratching the surface.
So to wrap things up, I encourage everyone listening to check out some of the resources we mentioned, and maybe even try having some philosophical conversations with the kids in your life. You might be surprised by what they have to say and how much they can teach you about philosophy.
Because every kid has the potential to be a philosopher, and every time we talk to a kid who's curious about the world, it's a chance for us to rediscover the joy of thinking about these big questions.
What a great way to end our deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep those philosophical wheels turning.